3 years ago, the whole city watched a black SUV plunge off a rain-soaked bridge and explode into a fireball that lit up the night sky. No body was ever recovered. The police closed the case within a month, ruling it an accidental death, and a grieving young widow buried an empty casket beneath a headstone that bore her husband's name. She cried for months, before she found the strength to breathe again, to smile again, to believe that life could still hold something good for her. On the exact morning she stood at the altar in a white gown, ready to whisper new vows to a different man, the heavy wooden doors of the church swung open without warning. A man in a black suit, his face marked by old scars, walked slowly down the aisle, while 300 guests sat frozen in disbelief. He stopped only a few feet from the bride, looked into the eyes that once knew him better than anyone on earth, and said the words that shattered the wedding into pieces. "Danielle," he said quietly, "I never died." Marcus Coleman and Danielle Coleman were the kind of couple that made other people believe in love again. He was a structural engineer who built bridges and towers with his own calculations, a man who measured his worth by what he could create with his hands and his mind. She was a corporate attorney, sharp and composed in every boardroom she entered, the kind of woman who never lost an argument she believed in. They had been married for 8 years, and in all that time, neither of them had ever raised their voice at the other in anger that lasted more than an hour. They had chosen, quietly and deliberately, not to have children yet, agreeing instead to build their careers first, to give each other room to become who they wanted to be, before adding a third heartbeat to their home. Friends often said that watching them together felt like watching two people who had somehow found the exact match to their own soul, effortless and unshakable. There was a particular stillness to their mornings that outsiders never saw. Marcus would rise before dawn, moving quietly through their kitchen so the coffee maker would not wake her, and Danielle would find him later at the small table by the window, blueprints spread out beside his mug, his eyes tired but calm. She used to tease him that he loved concrete and steal the way other men loved sports teams, and he would only smile, take her hand across the table, and remind her that a bridge built right could carry generations of people who would never know his name. That was enough for him. It had always been enough, that quiet certainty of purpose, the sense that his work mattered even when no one was watching. That autumn, everything in their lives seemed to be reaching a peak at the same time. Marcus was on the verge of signing a construction contract worth several $100 million, a deal that would place his firm among the most respected in the country. Danielle had just been told, in a private meeting behind closed doors, that she was being considered for senior partner, the youngest attorney in her firm's history to reach that level. They celebrated quietly one evening with wine on their balcony, watching the city lights flicker below them, certain that nothing could touch what they had built together. But 3 days before that celebration, while reviewing files for the very contract that was about to change his life, Marcus found something he was never supposed to see. Buried inside a stack of financial statements belonging to Ethan Ross's corporation were numbers that did not add up, transactions moved through shell accounts, money vanishing into places it should never have gone. He sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left, staring at the screen, his stomach tightening with a slow and certain dread. He had not yet told anyone. He had not called the police, had not even told Danielle, because some instinct in him whispered that this was not something to speak of carelessly. He printed nothing. He simply closed the file, turned off his computer, and sat in the dark for a long time, trying to convince himself that he had misread it, that there was some innocent explanation waiting to be found in the morning. There wasn't. That night, as he drove home through a light drizzle that had not yet turned into the storm it would become, his phone rang from a number he did not recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, almost gentle, which made it more terrifying than if it had screamed. "If you still want to live," the voice said, "forget what you just saw." Then the line went dead, and Marcus sat at a red light for nearly a full minute before he could make himself press the gas pedal again. His hands did not shake. Not yet. He gripped the wheel the way he gripped a blueprint that refused to balance, methodically, searching for the error, the missing variable that would make the whole structure hold. He told himself he would go home, hold Danielle, and decide what to do in the morning with a clear head. He did not know yet that morning would not come the way he expected, that the last ordinary night of his old life was already closing behind him like a door he could not see. The rain came down harder than the forecast had promised, sheets of water turning the highway into a dark mirror under the streetlights. Marcus gripped the wheel with both hands, his mind still tangled in the warning he had just received. Unable to decide whether to call Danielle, call the police, or simply drive somewhere far away and think. He never got the chance to decide. Headlights appeared suddenly in his mirror, too close, too fast, and before he could react, another SUV slammed into the side of his vehicle and forced it toward the guardrail. Metal screamed against metal. The wheel spun uselessly in his hands. As the car broke through the barrier and dropped into the black ravine below, the world tilting, the rain turning sideways through the windshield in his final seconds of awareness. The explosion lit up the valley like a second sun, visible from nearly a mile away. Traffic cameras captured the entire sequence in grainy, unforgiving detail: the swerve, the impact, the fall, and finally the fireball that consumed what was left of the vehicle at the bottom of the ravine. Emergency crews arrived within 20 minutes, but the fire had already done its work, and search teams spent 3 days combing through the wreckage without finding a single trace of a body. All they recovered was a wedding ring, blackened and warped by heat, found nearly 30 feet from the crash site, as if it had been thrown clear in the final violent second before the fire took everything else. Danielle received the call at 2 in the morning and did not remember later how she managed to drive herself to the hospital, only that she stood in a hallway holding a plastic bag with a ring inside it, unable to make her legs carry her any further. The nurses gave her tea she never drank. Someone placed a blanket around her shoulders that she did not remember accepting. She kept staring at the ring through the clear plastic, turning it slightly under the fluorescent light, as if enough attention might undo what had already happened. Somewhere behind her, a doctor spoke in the low, careful tone reserved for news that cannot be softened. But the words arrived to her, as if from underwater, distant and shapeless. All she understood, in the end, was that the ring was real and the man who wore it was gone. The funeral took place 2 weeks later, on a gray afternoon that seemed to match the mood of everyone in attendance. Danielle stood at the front of the church in black, holding herself upright through sheer will, accepting condolences from people whose names she would not remember the following day. The casket in front of her was empty, a fact that somehow made the grief heavier rather than lighter, because there was nothing solid to bury, nothing to point to and say, "This is where he rests now." She placed a single white rose on the polished wood and whispered something only she would ever know, words meant only for the man she believed had been taken from her forever. What none of the mourners in that church knew, what none of the police reports would ever record, was that somewhere far from that ravine, in a small fishing town along the coast, Marcus Coleman was still breathing. A fisherman named Walter Briggs found him tangled in wreckage debris that had drifted nearly 2 miles downriver, unconscious, burned along one side of his face and body, his pulse so faint that Walter almost mistook him for a corpse pulled from the water by accident. He carried Marcus to a small clinic run by a retired Army medic named Corporal Ray Dennison, a man who had learned long ago not to ask too many questions about strangers who arrived broken and nameless. For weeks, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, his body slowly mending while his mind remained a fractured landscape of half-formed memories. He knew, somehow, that there had been rain. He knew there had been a phone call. He knew there was a woman with warm brown eyes whose face he could almost see. But every time he reached for her name, it slipped away like smoke between his fingers. Ray kept a small notebook beside the cot, writing down every fragment Marcus muttered in his sleep, hoping the pieces might eventually form a picture. Blue door, concrete numbers, a ring, a laugh he could not place, but that made his chest ache every time it surfaced in a dream. Some nights Marcus woke gasping, certain he was still falling, certain the water closing over him would never let go, and Ray would sit with him in the dark, saying nothing, simply present, the way a good medic learns to be present for men who have seen more than they can carry alone. Ray kept him hidden, sensing correctly that whoever had run Marcus off that road would not hesitate to finish the job if they learned he had survived. He changed the dressings on Marcus's burns himself, refused to file any paperwork with local authorities, and told the few neighbors who asked that the man was a cousin recovering from a workplace accident. Meanwhile, back in the city, a homicide detective named Lisa Brooks stared at the crash file on her desk and felt something in her gut that refused to settle. The official report called it an accident caused by weather conditions and driver error. But Lisa had reviewed thousands of accident scenes in her career, and this one did not sit right. The skid marks suggested a second vehicle had been present, yet no other car had ever been identified or questioned. When she requested Marcus's DNA records from the state database to confirm identity through fragment analysis, she was told, politely but firmly, that the files had been misplaced, an explanation she had never once heard in 15 years on the force. Lisa kept the file in her bottom drawer, long after her captain told her to close it. She would take it out on slow nights, spreading the photographs across her desk, tracing the skid marks with her finger, as if she could still find the second car hiding somewhere in the grain of the image. She did not believe in accidents that erased evidence this cleanly. Somewhere in her mind, a small, stubborn certainty took root, and it would stay there for 3 long years, waiting for the day the truth finally surfaced on its own. Weeks became a month, and slowly, painfully, pieces of Marcus's memory began returning to him in fragments, arriving usually at night, in dreams that felt too vivid to be dreams at all. He remembered a name now, Ethan Ross. He remembered numbers on a screen that did not belong there, and a voice on a phone telling him that silence was the price of survival. He remembered, with a jolt that left him gasping in his cot, a woman's laugh, warm and rich, the laugh of someone named Danielle, and the memory arrived with such force that tears slid down the scarred side of his face before he even understood why he was crying. He understood, in that quiet moment on a cot in a stranger's clinic, 3 counties away from his old life, that what happened to him on that bridge had never been an accident. It had been an execution, carried out with precision, meant to erase him from the world entirely, and somehow, impossibly, it had failed. He began to heal faster after that, as if remembering gave his body a reason to keep fighting. He walked the beach at dawn, when no one else was awake, letting the cold water numb the ache in his leg, watching the horizon the way he used to watch a blueprint, searching for the line that would hold everything together. Somewhere out there, past the gray water and the gulls circling low over the tide, was a city that believed him dead, and a woman who was, at that very moment, learning to live without him. The thought was unbearable. It was also, in a strange way, the thing that kept him alive. Ray warned him more than once that healing too quickly, moving too soon, could undo months of careful recovery, but Marcus had stopped listening to caution the way other men stop listening to weather reports before a storm they intend to walk straight into anyway. He practiced writing his own name again with his weaker hand, over and over on scraps of paper, as if reclaiming the letters might help him reclaim the life attached to them. He studied his reflection in a cracked mirror above the clinic sink some mornings, tracing the scar along his jaw with 2 fingers, wondering whether the woman he remembered would still recognize the man staring back at him. He did not yet know the answer. He only knew he intended to find out. 3 years passed in the city Marcus had once called home, and in that time, Danielle rebuilt her life one careful piece at a time. For the first 2 years, she never once removed her wedding ring, wearing it to depositions, to dinners with friends who gently suggested she try dating again, to the lonely nights when she sat on the same balcony where she and Marcus had once celebrated their triumphs together. She turned away every man who showed interest, not out of bitterness, but because none of them felt like anything more than a shadow standing where a person used to be. Her family worried about her, in the quiet way families do, never pushing too hard, but always present, always reminding her gently that grief, however sacred, was not meant to be a permanent home. She threw herself into her work instead, earning the senior partnership she had once celebrated with the man she lost, though the victory felt strangely hollow without him there to share it. There were nights she still reached across the bed before catching herself, the sheets cold beneath her fingers, the silence too large for one person to fill. She kept his side of the closet untouched for the first year, his shirts still hanging in careful rows, until her sister finally convinced her, gently, that some things had to be released before healing could begin. She donated the shirts on a rainy afternoon, sitting afterward on the floor of the empty closet, crying in a way that felt less like grief and more like surrender. She returned to work 3 weeks after the funeral, far sooner than anyone expected, because the alternative was sitting in an apartment full of silence that pressed against her chest like a physical weight. Her colleagues learned quickly not to mention his name unless she brought it up first. And she learned in turn how to build a careful wall around the parts of herself that still ached, presenting a composed face to conference rooms full of people who never asked what it cost her to walk in each morning. Some evenings she drove past the old ravine on her way home, though she told no one, parking on the shoulder for a few minutes just to sit with the quiet, before continuing on, as if she had never stopped at all. It was at a charity gala, nearly 2.5 years after the accident, that Andre Whitfield first appeared in her life, introduced by a mutual colleague who thought the two of them might simply enjoy a conversation. Andre was polished in a way that seemed effortless, successful in real estate development, quick to laugh but careful with his words, the kind of man who remembered small details from previous conversations and brought them up weeks later, as if they mattered. He did not push her. He did not pretend to understand her grief or claim to be able to fill the space Marcus had left behind. Instead, he simply kept showing up, patient and steady, sending flowers on difficult anniversaries, sitting quietly beside her on nights when she could not speak at all. Slowly, almost against her own expectations, Danielle found herself looking forward to his calls, and somewhere in the space between missing one man and healing beside another, she allowed herself to imagine a future again. He never once asked her to forget Marcus. That, more than anything, was what disarmed her defenses. He would ask about her husband sometimes, gently, letting her talk about the man she had loved without flinching or changing the subject, and she mistook his patience for depth, never suspecting it was, in truth, a carefully rehearsed performance built for exactly this purpose. Her family encouraged the relationship, relieved to see color return to her face after so long in shadow, and within a year, Andre proposed on a rooftop overlooking the same skyline Danielle used to watch with Marcus. She said yes through tears that carried both joy and a quiet, unspoken grief she suspected would never fully leave her. What no one around that rooftop knew, what Danielle herself had no way of knowing, was that Andre Whitfield's connection to her life was not born from coincidence at all. Years earlier, Andre had served as a legal consultant for Ethan Ross's corporation, quietly structuring the very shell transactions Marcus had stumbled upon the night everything changed. He had watched Danielle from a careful distance long before that gala, waiting for the appropriate moment to enter her orbit, positioned there by men who understood that grief, when guided gently, could be shaped into something useful. While Danielle planned a wedding she believed would finally close a painful chapter of her life, Marcus, hundreds of miles away, had regained enough strength and enough memory to begin his own quiet investigation. He moved carefully, using aliases, contacting only people he trusted absolutely, piecing together the financial trail that had nearly cost him his life. What he uncovered went far beyond what he had originally seen on that fateful night. Ethan Ross had embezzled several $billion across a decade, laundering the money through offshore accounts and fraudulent construction contracts, the very kind of contracts Marcus's own firm had once been invited to bid on. Marcus realized, with a coldness that settled deep into his chest, that his own contract had likely been part of the scheme, a legitimate cover meant to disguise the flow of stolen money moving through legal channels. He worked from a rented room above a hardware store, a laptop bought with cash, his notes written by hand and burned each night after he memorized them. He learned to move through the world quietly, wearing a cap low over his scarred face, avoiding cameras, avoiding anyone who might recognize the man the newspapers once called a tragic victim of the storm. There were nights the loneliness nearly broke him, nights he almost picked up a phone to call her just to hear her voice one more time, before reminding himself that a single mistake could put her in danger too. He kept a single photograph of her tucked inside his jacket, its edges soft from handling, and some nights he would simply sit with it under a bare light bulb, studying the curve of her smile as though memorizing it for an exam he could not afford to fail. He thought often of the life they had built together, the mornings with coffee and blueprints, the sound of her laugh through the apartment walls, and he let those memories steady his hands whenever the fear of being found threatened to overwhelm him. Every document he uncovered, every late night spent decoding financial statements by lamplight, brought him one step closer to a door he was terrified might already be closed to him forever. As he dug deeper, another name kept surfacing in the documents, appearing again and again beside Ethan Ross's signature on transfer agreements and confidentiality clauses. Andre Whitfield. Marcus stared at that name for a long time, unaware that this same man was, at that very moment, preparing to marry the woman Marcus had spent 3 years trying to remember, trying to survive for, trying to find his way back to. He did not yet understand the full shape of the connection, but he understood enough to know that time was no longer a luxury he could afford. He gathered every document, every recording, every fragment of proof he had collected in his long recovery, encrypted them, and sent copies to a federal contact he had cautiously built trust with over the past several months. Then, for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Coleman began the long journey home, uncertain of what or who he would find waiting for him. He stood at the edge of the highway one last time before leaving the coast, looking out at the same water that had nearly claimed him, and allowed himself for one brief moment to grieve the years already lost. Then he turned toward the city, toward whatever waited for him there, and began to walk. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows of the same church where Marcus and Danielle had once exchanged their own vows 8 years earlier. Though none of the guests seemed to notice the coincidence, or perhaps simply chose not to speak of it. The pews filled steadily with family, friends, and colleagues, all dressed in their finest, all smiling the particular smile people wear at weddings, meant to celebrate survival after tragedy. Danielle stood in a private room adjoining the sanctuary, her gown fitted perfectly, her hands trembling slightly as her sister helped fasten the final buttons along her back. She caught her own reflection in the mirror and felt, for just a moment, a strange hesitation she could not name, a flicker of something unresolved beneath the joy she had worked so hard to feel. She touched the small locket at her throat, a gift from Andre, and told herself the hesitation was only nerves, the same nerves every bride carried on her wedding morning. Somewhere beneath that explanation, quiet and persistent, was a feeling she could not name, a sense that something in the room had shifted, though nothing around her had actually moved. Andre waited at the front of the church, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced calm, occasionally glancing toward the doors with the mild impatience of a man eager to reach the next chapter of a plan long in motion. The priest stepped forward, opened his book, and the room settled into the particular silence that precedes a wedding, the kind of hush filled with anticipation rather than emptiness. Danielle began her walk down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on Andre, her breath steady despite the pounding in her chest. She was 3 steps from the altar, close enough to see the relief in Andre's expression, when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church groaned open, with a sound that cut through the organ music like a blade. Every head in the room turned at once. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall, dressed in a simple black suit, his face marked along one side by scars that caught the afternoon light streaming in behind him. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed, because the man walking slowly down the center aisle bore an impossible resemblance to someone every person in that room had buried 3 years earlier. Danielle's bouquet slipped from her fingers and struck the floor with a soft, terrible thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Andre's face drained of color so completely that he looked, for a moment, more like a ghost than the man now approaching the altar. Marcus stopped a few feet away from the woman he had spent 3 years fighting to return to, looked into eyes he had once believed he would never see again, and spoke 4 quiet words into the stunned silence of the church. "I'm sorry I'm late." For a moment, time itself seemed to stop inside those walls. Danielle's hand rose slowly to her mouth, her eyes searching his face, tracing the scars, the years, the impossible fact of him standing there breathing, and something in her chest broke open all at once, grief and joy arriving together, indistinguishable from one another. She whispered his name once, barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might make him disappear again, the way he had disappeared before. Chaos did not erupt immediately, though it would soon enough. First there was only stillness, the entire congregation frozen in collective disbelief, as if the church itself were holding its breath. Danielle's lips parted, but no sound emerged, her mind unable to reconcile the man standing before her with the empty casket she had wept over for 3 long years. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a small folder, worn at the edges from months of careful handling, and held it out not toward Danielle, but toward the side aisle, where a woman in plain clothes had already begun moving forward with quiet authority. Detective Lisa Brooks had been waiting outside the church for nearly an hour, alerted days earlier by a message from a man she had once assumed was dead, and now she stepped through the doors, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, her expression grim and focused. Inside the folder were bank records tracing money through 6 different shell companies, video footage from a traffic camera that had never been fully reviewed by the original investigators, sworn statements from 2 former employees willing to testify against Ethan Ross, and GPS data proving that a second vehicle, registered under a name connected to Andre Whitfield's firm, had been present at the crash site the night Marcus disappeared. Andre began stammering denials before anyone had even accused him of anything specific, his composure cracking in a way that told its own story to everyone watching. Marcus did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Danielle, on the tears now sliding freely down her face, and something in his expression softened, even as the church around them dissolved into murmurs and gasps. He did not blame her. He had never once, in 3 years of pain and searching, blamed her for believing what everyone had told her to believe. Word spread through the church that federal agents were already en route, having received the documents Marcus sent weeks earlier as insurance against exactly this kind of confrontation. Guests who had come to celebrate a wedding now found themselves witnesses to the unraveling of a conspiracy that reached into one of the city's most respected corporations. Ethan Ross, who had been seated quietly in a rear pew under an assumed identity, watching the ceremony he believed would finally close the loose end that was Marcus Coleman, rose from his seat and attempted to slip toward a side exit. 2 officers intercepted him before he reached the door, and for the first time in years, the calm, controlling voice that had once ordered a man's death cracked into something desperate and afraid. Marcus turned to face him across the church, still holding the folder that had taken 3 years of pain to compile, and spoke the words he had rehearsed in his mind, more times than he could count. "Everything is already with the authorities," he said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Every account, every wire transfer, every name. There is nothing left for you to hide." Ethan's expression shifted from fury to something close to despair as he realized the scope of what had already slipped beyond his control. Andre, cornered and shaking, began speaking rapidly, insisting that he had only handled legal paperwork for Ross's transactions, that he had never known Marcus's death was anything more than a tragic accident, though the desperation in his voice convinced almost no one listening. Danielle stood motionless near the altar, still in her wedding gown, watching the man she had planned to marry crumble before her eyes, while the man she had mourned for 3 years stood only a few feet away, alive and real and impossibly present. The realization settled over her slowly, cruelly, that she had been guided into this marriage by forces far beyond her own choosing, that her grief had been studied and shaped by people who understood exactly how to lead a broken heart wherever they needed it to go. She felt something cold move through her chest, not quite anger, not quite grief, but a strange sorrow for the version of herself who had trusted so completely without ever suspecting the architecture beneath her own healing. Within the hour, federal agents arrived to formally take custody of Ethan Ross, whose empire began unraveling in real time as reporters outside the church relayed the unfolding scandal to a stunned city. Andre was taken in for questioning, his claims of ignorance met with visible skepticism from investigators who had already begun matching his signature to a dozen fraudulent documents. Danielle remained in the small side room where she had dressed only hours earlier, her wedding gown now feeling like a costume from a play that had gone terribly wrong. Her hands pressed against her face as she tried to steady her breathing. When Marcus finally stepped into the doorway, quiet and hesitant, unsure of his welcome after 3 years of silence, she rose from the chair and crossed the room without a word. She sank to her knees in front of him, her gown pooling around her on the floor, and wept in a way she had not allowed herself to weep even at his funeral, when the world had told her grief was appropriate and expected. She begged him to forgive her, for the wedding, for moving on, for the ring she had eventually stopped wearing, for every small betrayal she now saw scattered across the last 3 years of her life. Marcus knelt down in front of her, took her trembling hands in his, and waited until her sobs quieted enough for her to hear him. He told her, in a voice roughened by everything he had survived, that the scars on his body had never been the hardest part of the last 3 years. The hardest part, he said, had been imagining her spending the rest of her life believing the man who loved her most had abandoned her to grief without ever coming back. Danielle collapsed against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her the way he had 1,000 times before, both of them shaking, both of them finally, achingly, together again. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the floor of a small room, still cluttered with wedding flowers, meant for another man, saying nothing, simply breathing in the impossible fact of each other. Outside the door, the sound of sirens and footsteps and hurried voices continued. But inside that room, for the first time in 3 years, there was only quiet, and only them. Later that evening, once the church had emptied and the last patrol car had pulled away, Marcus and Danielle sat together on the front steps beneath a sky just beginning to darken, her wedding gown traded for a borrowed jacket someone had left behind. Neither of them spoke for a long while, content simply to sit shoulder to shoulder, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one along the avenue. She finally asked him how he survived, and he told her the truth, that some nights survival had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with stubbornness, a refusal to let the last image in his mind be anything other than her face. She rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in 3 years, neither of them felt the need to say anything else at all. In the months that followed, Ethan Ross's trial dominated headlines across the country, exposing a decade of corruption that reached into government contracts, offshore banking, and the deaths of at least 2 other people, whose accidents suddenly looked far less accidental under renewed investigation. Andre Whitfield accepted a plea agreement, admitting to obstruction charges in exchange for cooperation, though the city's trust in him never recovered, and he quietly relocated far from the community that once welcomed him. Marcus underwent additional surgeries to address the lingering damage from his injuries, slowly regaining full strength under the care of doctors his old insurance had once assumed would never be needed again. Danielle resigned from the firm that had employed her for over a decade, unable to separate its walls from the version of herself who had planned a wedding built on lies she never chose. Detective Lisa Brooks was the one who finally closed the old file, 3 years after she first refused to believe it, writing across the final page in her own careful handwriting that the case had been reopened and resolved. She kept a copy of that final report in her desk long after the trial ended, not out of pride, but as a quiet reminder that instinct, however inconvenient, was sometimes the only thing standing between the truth and a lie that nearly succeeded. She visited Marcus and Danielle once, months later, not on official business, but simply to see for herself that the story she had spent 3 years chasing had truly ended the way she hoped it would. She found them in the small office of their new foundation, surrounded by folders bearing other families' names, other unsolved questions, and she recognized in their eyes the same quiet determination she had carried through years of doubt. Before leaving, she told them plainly that she had never once believed the official story, not for a single day, and Danielle took her hand and thanked her for being the one person who kept looking when everyone else had already stopped. Together, Marcus and Danielle created a foundation dedicated to supporting families of victims caught in cases eerily similar to their own, individuals wrongly presumed dead, families manipulated by corporate cover-ups, survivors left to rebuild lives shattered by other people's greed. The work gave them both a sense of purpose that neither could have found alone, transforming 3 years of unimaginable pain into something that might spare other families the same suffering. On a quiet afternoon, nearly a year after that fateful wedding day, Marcus and Danielle stood once more in a small church. Though this time, the guest list held only the people who had never stopped believing in them, family members and close friends, who understood exactly what this new ceremony truly meant. Danielle wore a simpler dress this time, her hair loose around her shoulders, her hands steady as she faced the man who had once been declared dead by an entire city and had refused, against every possible odds, to stay lost. Marcus looked at her, the way he had looked at her on their very first wedding day, 8 years earlier. Though something deeper had settled into his gaze now, something forged by loss and survival and an unbreakable determination to return. When it came time for his vows, he spoke slowly, his voice carrying through the small, sunlit room with a weight that silenced even the soft rustle of programs in the pews. "If fate tried to take you from me 1,000 more times," he said, "I would find my way back to you every single time." Danielle's tears fell freely as she reached for his hands, and the rings they exchanged that day felt heavier with meaning than any promise either of them had ever spoken before. Her own vows came quietly, her voice steady despite the tears. She told him that grief had once taught her how to survive without him, but that his return had taught her something far greater, that some bonds are simply too strong for distance, or silence, or even death itself, to sever completely. She promised him she would never again mistake his absence for his ending, that she would carry the memory of his return in her chest for the rest of her life, a quiet proof that love, real love, does not surrender so easily. As the small ceremony ended, and the two of them turned to walk together down the aisle, sunlight spilled through the open doors ahead of them, warm and golden across the worn wooden floor. Their hands remained locked together, fingers laced the way they had been on countless mornings before tragedy ever touched their lives, before conspiracy and grief and impossible survival became threads woven permanently into their story. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees lining the church steps, carrying with it the quiet, steady sense that whatever had been broken between them was, at last, fully and completely healed. They walked into the morning light together, not as strangers rebuilding something lost, but as two people who had proven, against every possible odd stacked against them, that love, real love, does not end simply because the world declares it over. It waits, it survives, and sometimes it walks back through the doors, exactly when it is needed most.